Have you ever felt like your podcasting efforts are scattered and inconsistent? Or maybe you're struggling to come up with fresh ideas and keep your audience engaged. A content calendar is the perfect solution that you need in order to help you achieve all of your podcast goals and make those efforts actually work. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Alicia Galati. I'm the founder of Galati Media, a full-service podcast management agency where we help impact-driven businesses, thought leaders, and nonprofits use their podcasts to make the difference in the world that they want to see. Today, we're going to be talking through how to create a content plan and content calendar that's actually going to help you achieve your podcast goals. So whether you're starting out your podcast, kind of ruminating on this idea, or you are someone who has a podcast but feels like you're kind of drowning in what am I going to say next, then this episode is definitely for you. If you're not sure why you might need a content calendar, let's go ahead and get into why every podcaster really should have a content calendar. And when I say content calendar, I don't mean that you have to have a huge notebook where you're planning out all of your content. It could be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet of here are the episodes that I'm going to be tackling over the next few weeks, or here are the guests that I have lined up over the next few weeks. So what a content calendar does is it reduces the stress and the overwhelm that happens when you're not really sure what to talk about next on your show. This happened to me when I started my first podcast. It was definitely a struggle as I was working my 9 to 5, doing a bunch of side hustle stuff, and having a podcast that I got to the point where I ran out of interviews. I didn't really know what else I wanted to say to my audience. And I fell off of the podcast wagon that way. And honestly, if I had had a content calendar or I had a content plan, then I would have been able to continue podcasting well into a longer time than that. I don't know that I would have kept going indefinitely with that content or specifically with that podcast because the content wasn't something that I really was interested in talking about anymore, but I would have gone longer than I had. So what a content calendar can do is it can also ensure that you're consistently publishing episodes. Have you ever found yourself missing a week or missing when you were supposed to show up for your audience when you said you would? If you found yourself doing that, a content calendar can help you to build anticipation and loyalty among your listeners and create that consistent schedule. I saw someone do this, and I think it's such a great strategy. At the end of last year, this will be going live in February, so it was December timeframe when I saw a pretty popular podcast say, here are the episodes to look forward to in the next month. They had to have a content plan and a content calendar in order to achieve that. So that's something that you can do to keep the anticipation with your audience going, get them excited about it, and also help you be able to show up as someone who is doing what you said you're going to do. I was talking to my friend Emily, and I love her take on this. She's been on the show quite a few times, and we'll make sure we link her information in the show notes. But she was talking about how when you are saying you're going to be consistent doesn't necessarily mean every day. It doesn't mean every week. You really need to look at what your frequency is and then show up when you say you are. And that means you are consistent. So if your frequency is once a month, or if your frequency is every other week, and you say to your audience, I am going to show up at this frequency, then if you do that, you are being consistent. So just showing up when you say you will, that is creating consistency. So don't feel like it has to be every week. Make sure that you are creating a publishing schedule that actually works for you. If you have a team, a content calendar is imperative. Otherwise, you have someone who's last minute saying, wait, I need to change this. I need to switch this. No, let's not stress your team out. Let's not stress yourself out, and create a content calendar that's going to work for you and for your team. So what makes an effective content calendar? First thing that you want to make sure that you have in there is the episode topics and the formats. I have recently launched a new podcast that is a hobby podcast, and I'm using it as a way to test out what it would be like to launch a podcast right now. And also having a ton of fun with it and having conversations that I've really wanted to have for a while, but in a niche that is not at all what I do for my business. So, in that podcast, when I was coming up with the ideas of how I wanted my episode topics and my format to be, I decided that I wanted to mix it up. How could I differentiate myself, which we talked about in the last one that I did for market research, differentiating yourself against your competition. And so I launched a podcast all about reading romance novels. And what I wanted to do with that is not have a podcast that's like other podcasts. And a lot of other podcasts in the romance space and in the bookish space tend to be review forward. And I have nothing against reviews. I like reviews too. I don't like to do reviews, but I like reviews too. And I knew that I wanted to create something that was different and that was something that was missing. And so what I decided to do was change the format to be just a few solo episodes, like 3 per season, and then having every other episode be an author who I can feature, and then a bookish content creator that I can collaborate with. And so what that allowed me to do is easily plan out my content calendar for this podcast, but then it also let me see what are those formats that I wanted to do, very clearly be able to see those. So that is one of the key elements of a content calendar is that you have the episode topics and the formats. Next, you want to have what are those promotional activities that you need to be doing for your podcast, especially if you are just starting out. So for me, I kind of have those set in stone. I know what my content calendar looks like for promotions. And so I don't need to have that necessarily in my content calendar unless I were sharing it with my team to say, here is exactly what you need to be doing on the promotion side. So have that planned, know exactly what you're doing. What are those cross promotions? What are the social media posts that you're doing? How are you collaborating with your guests to ensure that they are making the most of the episode that they were featured on? Next, you want to have that publishing schedule and deadlines. So any dates that you have on there that this is when the episode goes live. Here's maybe when I'm going to re-release it if you're someone who does re-releases, and then having that all planned out. And then finally, have content repurposing plans. I highly recommend that you turn your podcast episodes into blog posts or LinkedIn articles if you're someone who doesn't want to bother with putting them on your website or wants to worry about that. Social media places, sending it to your email list, and any other forms of content, whether that is short videos or threads types of posts or X types of posts, very short content. Any way that you can repurpose your podcast. And we do have an episode on different ways to repurpose your podcast. We'll make sure that's linked in the show notes as well. So you can go back and check out that blog post or listen to the full episode. Now, here are some tools that I like to use when it comes to planning out my podcast content. Any type of project management tool is going to benefit you here. Trello is one. I actually have a Trello podcast management board. I'll make sure I link that in the show notes. You can go ahead and grab that. Asana is another one. I do not use Asana. I use it with clients, but not for myself in any way. And so I do not have one for that. Airtable is another one. Notion is another one. I use ClickUp, and I also have a podcast content calendar that I can make sure that you guys check out if you use ClickUp. I like ClickUp for teams. If you don't have a team, I don't recommend using something as robust as ClickUp. Trello, Asana, Notion, those places work perfectly well if you're someone who wants something that is simpler and easier to manage. I would say pick between Trello and Asana for those if you're just by yourself. There are pros and cons, obviously, to each of these strategies. You can also go with a simple Excel spreadsheet. And there is nothing wrong with simply saying, here's the episode number, here's what the episode is going to be about, here's the guest name, here's when it needs to go live. And then here are the places that I'm going to be promoting it and creating it that way. There are so many tools out there. You don't have to spend extra money if you don't want to or if you don't need to in these spaces to create a content plan and a content calendar. I want to emphasize here that you need to be flexible with your content calendar. You might have a plan that someone is going to go live in the next 2 weeks and something happens where they need to reschedule. This is where having a list of episodes that you could choose from, I like to say have at least 25 episodes that you could talk about at any time, 10 as a minimum, but 25 is great. Just to be able to say, hey, this guest is not going to be here. I can do a solo episode and really show up well for my audience because I've got this in the bag already and I know exactly what I'm going to talk about. So having a plan that is flexible and adaptable, if you're finding in the first 3 months that an Excel spreadsheet is just not robust enough for you, then you might want to consider moving to another space. So be flexible. It is okay if there are unexpected delays or changes to your schedule. We're dealing with humans here. So it's important that you, as a human, are understanding and respectful of your guests. I don't think that you should give them a bunch of chances, right? So if someone reschedules 5 times, at that point, they're not interested in being on your show and you need to move on. And you can create those boundaries however you want. But be adaptable, be flexible, create a plan that works for you, but have some in your pocket that you could pull out at any time if you need to. There are a lot of different ways that having a content plan has helped. I can give you a few examples for my own client. Obviously, I gave you some for myself, but for our clients, there was one who she had batch recorded a bunch of episodes. And because she wasn't looking at her content calendar regularly, it got to a point where we were 2 episodes out of her being completely out of episodes and she got sick. You never want to get to that point where you're not regularly checking on your content calendar to see where am I at? How many guests do I realistically need? What do I need to do to get those guests, especially if you are feeling really good? Record those episodes. Don't wait until you are sick or you're completely out of episodes. And then we have another client who she likes to not batch so far ahead. I believe she does about 3 months ahead of planning and goes by themes. And so that helps her to be really strategic, saying, okay, in 3 months, I know my theme is going to be around home life. And so I know that I need those types of guests who are going to be talking about creating a better home life based on productivity and all of that fun stuff. And so understanding her audience, knowing what her audience needs, that helps her to be able to show up really well and create these kind of pockets of themes where her content calendar can be planned out and she can be talking to people when they pitch her to be on the show. She's not just accepting everyone. She's saying, hey, you would fit best in this category. And so I want to make sure that you have space on this day instead of beforehand. So there are lots of different ways to create a content calendar. These are going to help you at least get started. If you're feeling overwhelmed or you're not really sure what to do, I highly recommend downloading our free podcast workflow checklist because that is a really great resource, as well as our podcast launch checklist if you're just getting started. Those 2 resources are going to help you, but the podcast workflow checklist is good because it shows you every step that needs to happen from ideation to promotion for your podcast episode. I also want to say that if you've listened thus far, first of all, thank you for listening all the way through. This quarter, I'm going to be doing 2 live strategy sessions that are going to be free. If you're someone who needs a podcast audit or wants to talk through the strategy of your podcast and you cannot financially afford it right now, please make sure you check the link in the show notes. I'll have a way where you could potentially be one of those 2 slots where we will use it as podcast content. So you'll be featured on the podcast, but I will talk through all of your questions with you within about 30 minutes. So we'll make sure to have that link in the show notes as well as the YouTube description. I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me on Instagram or LinkedIn. Alicia Galati. We'll make sure we have links for those as well in the show notes. Until next time, happy podcasting.